Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Wendigo horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story. I hunt Wendigos for a living. My last hunt wasn't a Wendigo. Hi, I'm a 17-year-old Wendigo hunter. I started because, well, that doesn't matter right now. I wanted to write down the encounters I had, no sleep seemed perfect. Day one, I got called down to an abandoned house at the end of my street. I carried my daggers, made of silver. When I got down to the house, I heard it, a Wendigo. At this time, my first hunt, I wasn't prepared. By the time I located the sick bastard, he had the advantage. I was pinned down and his mouth was almost on my neck. I managed to kick him off me, the back up. Wendigos are stupid sometimes. He stood up and roared, but he was focused on dinner, not the train that dismembered him on impact. I burned what was left of him and collected the ashes. Job done. Day two today, I hunted cautiously, carrying my bow and daggers. I found it feeding on a deer in a tunnel. Thank God for rednecks. I shot an arrow to a rock. The Wendigo looked at the rock. The trap was set. The Wendigo walked over and I grabbed the explosives my neighbor gave me and I lit one and tossed it. The Wendigo looked at me a bit too late. He was blown apart. Not much left because I put holy ash and silver shrapnel in the explosive. He wouldn't be getting up. Day three, finally, I got a call about the Wendigo on the mountain. I went up there with a gift my neighbor. His shotgun he left me in his will. I have slugs in the barrels and extra in my pocket. I went up to the cliff side and found the cave, but these are smart ones. Yes, these. There are multiple. They manipulated the sounds of my sister, the one they killed. There was an old car next to their lair. Join us, hunt with us, stop killing your family, I yelled in reply. If you're my family, then I'll put you out of your mercy. I aimed at the car and fired. The explosion of the gas tank closed the cave off, but the alpha got out and attacked me. His claw slashed my leg. I still have a scar. I drew my dagger and put it in his neck and flipped over. His back's on the forest floor. I stood up and he did too. I unloaded a slug into his chest, sending him flying. I reloaded and splattered his head against the wall. The sick son of a bitch that took Elizabeth from me was dead. I dragged him home and burned him in the basement with stove. Day four today, I was called to investigate some dead swimmers in the stream, cuts and parts of their body carved off. This was not a Wendigo. I prepared for one hell of a hunt. I went to the waterfall and got ambushed by a massive wolf, a skinwalker. I stuck a knife in the wolf's neck and it recoiled. I grabbed the shotgun and fired, knocking it back. I ripped the knife out and kicked it down the waterfall. I pulled out my dad's .44 Magnum and put a bullet in the thing's head, between the eyes. My one bullet was a silver hollow point filled with poisons, cyanide and wolfsbane. The tip melted when blood got into contact. The tip was mercury and the skinwalker fell. Cyanide and wolfsbane destroying his brain and heart. Mercury attacking his blood. I left him for Wendigo bait. They would fall for something this big any day. And that's where we are now. I got a report of some chupacabra sightings down south, so if I come back, I'll make sure to tell you guys. Second story. My wife and I found a door in the middle of the woods. What the hell? What is it, honey? My wife's voice called out from behind me. It's a door. She laughed. Did you break into the pot stash early? We're in the middle of the woods. Why would there be a, oh, huh? Karen stopped as she saw it, and we stood shoulder to shoulder looking at it. An old wooden door built into the side of a hill in the middle of nowhere. It really is crazy what you can find out on these expeditions sometimes, huh, honey? She grinned. Should we knock? I shook my head. I'm not really sure I want to meet the kind of person that lives inside a hill. Oh, come on. Karen punched my shoulder. Where's your sense of adventure? Karen strode up to the door and gave it a polite knock. Hello. I'm looking for a Mr. Beard. A Mr. Tree Beard? I chuckled as I shook my head. Karen never let me forget the little wonderful things about her that made me fall in love with her. She turned to me in mock disappointment. "I don't think anybody's home, honey," she said. "All right, come on," I said. "We've got enough shrooms for now. Let's find a good place to trip." "Are you kidding? God, I married the most boring man in the universe. We've got to go inside. What if someone lives there? What if somebody lives in a hill in the woods? I think the man who built his house underground in a forest will be understanding if we offer to share some of our pot with him. You assume that just because he lives in a hill he smokes pot?" "I don't know, Karen. That's pretty racist." "Racist? Against who?" "Tree people, obviously. Who else?" Karen laughed and punched me in the shoulder again. I feigned being hurt, even though I loved it when she did that. "All right," I finally agreed. After all, if I didn't completely ignore common sense sometimes, I wouldn't be married to you in the first place. You're really funny. After I kick you out of the house, maybe you can live with Mr. Treebeard out here in the woods. I chuckled and tried the knob. The door was unlocked. As we pushed it open, we were greeted by a damp, mossy smell. The room inside was pitch black, but it seemed to be made entirely of rock, not dirt like I had expected. "Hold on a second," I said, sliding the pack off onto the ground and fumbling around inside for the flashlight. I flipped it on and scanned the walls. What the? The walls were all covered in some sort of nonsensical carvings. It reminded me of when we'd studied Egyptian hieroglyphics in school. "What is this? Wingdings?" Karen joked. I didn't answer. I had gotten the sudden feeling that I was being watched. I swung the flashlight to the back wall, only to discover that there wasn't one. The passage continued on and sloped downwards until the flashlight beam ended on the ceiling about 30 feet away. "Karen, I think we should dash." "Hold on. What's that?" Karen pointed to a dark spot on the floor, and I pointed the flashlight down to illuminate it. It was some kind of black liquid. "Motor oil," I joked. But Karen's wasn't joking around. She knelt down to look at the puddle. "It's blood, Danny," she said. "And look, it's leading down inside." I tilted the flashlight up. She was right. There was a blood trail leading deeper into the cavern. "It's probably just an animal," I said. "We should go." But Karen was already tying her hair up the way she did at work. She cupped her hands to her mouth. "Hello," she called out. I heard the call echo down the chamber, which must have been much larger than we had originally thought. "Is anybody down there?" Silence. But then, a barely audible call answered. "Help." The call sounded like it was coming from deep within the cavern. When I heard it, all the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and there was a sinking feeling in my chest. My every instinct started telling me to get the fuck out of this place. "Karen, it could be some sort of trap," I said. "Let's call the park rangers and then get the fuck out of here." "Somebody's hurt down there, Danny," she said sternly. But then her expression softened a bit. "Sorry, honey, this is what you got yourself into when you decided to marry a nurse." I sighed. I knew there was no stopping Karen once she had set her mind to do something, but I kept a tight grip on the heavy mag flashlight as we proceeded down the passageway. The blood trail got thinner as we walked deeper into the cavern. Whoever it was must have lost most of their blood in the antechamber. But if they were hurt out there, why had they retreated further into the cavern? Why not go outside where they had a chance of being found? It didn't make any sense. The air grew hotter and more humid as we went further down the increasingly steep slope, and a pungent smell of mold invaded our nostrils. I coughed as I breathed the horrid air. Where did all this dust come from? The deeper sections of the cavern walls had been cracked open by tree roots that had burrowed their way through the stone. "What the fuck is this place?" I whispered to Karen. "Maybe some sort of makeshift survival bunker?" She guessed. She cupped her hands to her mouth again. "Hello." Her shout echoed down the hallway. "If you can hear us, stay calm. We're going to help you get out to safety. Help." The voice was a little louder this time. We must be getting closer, I thought. but the sense of revulsion I felt on hearing the voice only got worse. Did she not feel it? As we went deeper inside, we found where the blood trail ended. There was a long smear of it on the ground. It looked like somebody had been dragged across the floor while bleeding heavily. And then it just stopped. Not even a drop after that. The walls of the cavern had now been almost completely overrun by roots, and breathing was getting difficult as the air had grown hotter and more choked with dust. Help. The voice was very close now, and I could now make it out more clearly. It sounded strange, all breathy and raspy, like a crude imitation of what a person should sound like. The floor had now become so steep it was impossible to go any further without risking a fall into God knows what. We've got to get down to him somehow. Karen wheezed out. She must have been having even more trouble breathing in the hot, thick dust than me. I've got it, I said. You step back. I pulled out the length of rope we'd brought in our emergency gear and tied it to one of the thick roots springing through the walls of the cave. I gave it a few firm tugs to make sure it was secure before tying the other end around my waist. I'd never wanted to turn around and go home so badly, but I knew there was no way Karen would leave without seeing this through. I started the climb down carefully, leaning over and moving the flashlight around to try to see what was going on without slipping and falling. I could see the vague outline of a man in the darkness, and I swung the flashlight beam over him. My blood went cold. Karen, run. What? Run. My breath was knocked out as the rope yanked back against my waist. I hoped it was Karen pulling, but I knew it wasn't. She wasn't that strong. I landed on the ground hard, and the rope continued to pull me backwards. Danny, what the fuck is Dash? Run, goddammit. She started to back away as the roots on the walls all started to move, slowly snaking their way towards us. I sawed through the rope with my pocket knife and stumbled forward into a sprint, yanking Karen along with me. She wouldn't have hesitated if she'd seen what I had. At the bottom of the cavern, a man had been suspended above the ground in a giant web of roots that were writhing and sliding through him. Little bulges were moving slowly up the roots that led away from his collapsed and shriveled body, one root jutting into his throat and twisting around every time he called for help. The plant was working his voice box like a puppet. We abandoned our flashlight and gear bag in the cave behind us as we sprinted towards the exit in total darkness, hacking and coughing as the moldy, dusty air of the cavern filled our lungs. I could feel myself tripping on roots that had not been there on the way in. I felt a yank on my hand as Karen fell, and we both tumbled down onto the writhing roots which circled around our limbs and began to drag us backwards. I started hacking desperately at them with my pocket knife. The roots recoiled as I struck them, and I managed to free my legs. I pulled at Karen's hands, but the roots were stronger. Just leave me, she shouted at me. Fuck no. I swung blindly at her legs, and the knife connected with a sick thud. I swung a dozen more times, slashing her legs once by mistake before she was loose enough to yank free. We kept running towards the door, and I could feel the air getting cooler and fresher, and the floor beginning to level out. We'd almost made it. I could see the outline of light around the door now. We were in full force into it, ricocheting off and bouncing back onto the ground. I scrambled up. Please be open. I grabbed the knob and yanked, and a torrent of fresh air and sunlight poured into the cavern. I grabbed Karen's arm and half-dragged her through open door before collapsing exhausted on the ground. We made it. I gasped out. My chest was heaving up and down as I lay on my back, coughing up all the dust from the cavern air. Yeah, Karen was bright red with exhaustion, her arms and legs covered in scratch marks. I don't imagine I looked much better. What the fuck was that? I said breathlessly, getting to my feet. Karen shook her head. I don't know, but let's get the fuck out of here. I helped Karen to her feet, and we both stood there panting and coughing with our hands on our knees. Karen coughed something up into her hand. Danny, she said, showing it to me. It was a small leaf. I watched her face as little green tendrils began to spread out and coil around under her skin, and I realized with horror that it hadn't been dust we were breathing in. It had been spores. Third story. Encounter with a Wendigo-like creature? I had an experience several years ago that still causes me some manner of dread, so I thought I would ask other users if they have ever encountered the same creature or anything similar. For reference, this was at my parents' old house in the Texas Hill Country and during the summer. We had a few cats that lived at that house, and one of them was a calico who refused to stay inside most of the time. She would also take long walks with us. There is a creek on that property as well, and while usually we never had any issues while down there, this one time had proven to be quite strange. Topaz the cat was unwilling to cross in her usual spot, and it was eerily quiet. I noticed a little later that she was acting as if something was threatening her. So I looked up and saw it. This thing had long arms, and it was tall, but I don't remember anything like talons or claws. I do remember antlers and matted fur, but nothing gaunt or skeletal. And very large, dark eyes, oriented forward like a predator's would be. The weirdest thing about the whole situation was just being entirely overcome with fear and dread, literally to the point of vomiting. I threw up and sprinted back up to the house with my cat, and avoided the creek for ages, though weirdly I felt quite certain that whatever that thing was, it couldn't cross running water. And after a month, it felt like it had gone, and it was safe to go over there again alone. Now, as far as I know, there is no family history on either side for hallucinations, and even if there were, this would have been my only experience with one my entire life. And it's been almost a full decade since this happened. Mostly I am wondering if anything of this description and presence has been encountered before, especially in Texas. It has bothered me for quite a while, so I am quite curious about what others may make of it. Fourth story. Wendigos are coming back now we can't escape. I'm from a small town, so you might not know about this. I'm living with my parents. Was living with my parents anyway, so I am interested in cryptozoology. Wendigos, skinwalkers, all that. My friend came to me the other day and told me about this creature he saw with a deer skull outside of his house. His house is 2 houses down. It was a Wendigo. I told him what it was and what it does. He wanted to vomit. I wanted to vomit. We waited for a couple more days. We waited and waited until something happened. A park was near us a couple of miles from us. A couple was killed there, and only their child emerged. It was a child no more than 7 or 8 years old, blonde. You get the picture. We pulled her aside and asked her what happened. She said something that will haunt me to my grave. She said that a deer skull creature had come to the park and told her to play with it. The parents played too. The girl said that they played hide and seek. She hid in a broken tree. I asked her what did she do after that, and she said she was never found, and then she came from the park. She said something horrifying. She said she heard her parents scream, and then she heard tearing, splattering, and screams of agony. Then some staff came over and pulled her aside. Before she could go, I asked her, I said, "How did it not kill you?" She said, "Because it wasn't there." A couple more days, and about 34 children and 26 adults have been murdered, and there have been sightings of over 40 Wendigos eating chatting. Me and my friends have decided enough is enough. We brought guns, flamethrowers, explosives. My friend, let's name him Ryan, he stockpiled on hundreds of shotgun shells, a Saga 12, AK-47, Glocks, and a homemade bomb. I got another friend. He took a lot of begging, but he agreed. We went to a park that was a hotspot for Wendigos. We found 4 bodies unknown. We went on and found a forest, and we said, okay, this is probably it. We went into the forest. We brought a Dodge Hellcat if we needed to escape. We ran for over a mile and slowed down and set camp. Ryan told me about eyes in the forest following us. My other friend, let's call him Scott, he was seeing dead, mangled animals on the ground. We found our first Wendigo. We went into the forest and found the Wendigo. It moved at unbelievable speeds at well over 100 miles per hour. We let Ryan unleash his Saga 12. The Wendigo let out horrid screams. I quickly pulled out a flamethrower and burned it alive. We sat there for 15 minutes as the Wendigo was cooking and screaming. We picked the body up, and took out its heart. We heard more creatures. We knew it was more Wendigos. Before we could look to see what happened, Scott was gone. We found a trail of blood going deep into the woods. We couldn't go after him because there were 2 more of these damn things on us. I shot one over 14 times. It ran back into the forest. I went after the other Wendigo and cut its heart out with the sharpest stick I could find. Me and Ryan waited for over an hour just sitting praying Scott would come back. Me and Scott went deeper only to find Scott's body. Mangled, he had no eyes, his ribs and insides were showing. We found a walkie-talkie next to his body. We turned it on and something spoke. It had Scott's voice. It said in his voice, "Help guys, it's eating my stomach," it said. We ignored it. We looked over and saw one of those little craps about 300 feet away from us. It was the one I shot God knows how many times. I ran towards it with flamethrower. I lit it up, and it was screaming in agony as I was burning it alive for over 20 minutes. I sat down next to Ryan. We both said we need to get Scott's body. Then Scott sat down next to us and said, "Hey guys, I'm back." We aimed our weapons at his chest, and we asked him a series of questions. He got all correct. We went home. We had slaughtered 3 Wendigos. We came back 3 days later. We brought our homemade bomb. We went into the forest for over 26 miles. We found 2 Wendigos. One of them killed Ryan, stole him, and nearly slaughtered him in the forest. We then blew up the Wendigo. The 3 of us went and shot the other Wendigo with a Saga 12 in the chest, hitting its heart, killing it. The Wendigos got retaliation and killed 2 people, only a fraction of their losses. Last week it was outside my window. It had the walkie-talkie. We both talked at first, said, "Want to come out to play? It looks nice out today." I snapped back, "No, you just want to kill me." "You are right, I will kill you. You look very appetizing up there." I got my AR-15 and shot it God knows how many times. It ran into the forest, and it said through the walkie-talkie with Sabrina's voice she was my sister, but she had been dead for over 3 years. It said, "All right, I will give you a choice in 1 hour. I will kill someone you love, or I can have your hand." Neither, I snarled back. It then said in Scott's voice, "All right, I will do both," and I locked my door and slept praying that I won't die tonight. I heard scratching in my door for over 4 hours. I screamed at my door. The Wendigo then said, "If you can eat, why can't I eat also? We need so much food, and right now we need food, and you are my food at the moment." I waited and waited and waited, wanting this thing to get out of my house. Then it ran out of my house. It ran with incredible speed out of my house. It ran so fast that I thought that the house was going to collapse any second. Scott and Ryan went out of state to Ohio. We found more Wendigos. They had followed us to Ohio. They rammed our vehicle with such force it went flying over 600 yards away. We unloaded shots straight onto them and did some numbers, taking out 6 of them. We had to retreat back to our town over 80 miles away. We almost died several times along the way. More killings have been inflicted. 2 couples, 4 children, and 16 adults. 3 days ago, my friend Ryan was found dead. Me and Scott stayed up for several hours discussing this. I was suspicious of Scott because I felt he had this dark force around him. I asked him well over 30 questions. I didn't care. I was going to spot an error. After 3 hours, he got no incorrect. Over 14 hours later, Scott then looked at me. He smiled, and he had jagged teeth. He then said, "He tasted like cherries, and one day I'll taste you too." 5th story. Your friendly neighborhood Wendigo. Before I begin, I'm a 16-year-old male. About 3 years ago, I was in Virginia visiting family over summer. We were right outside the DC area and staying in a 2-story house near the freeway. On the other side of the freeway was a forest. So my mom, her boyfriend Eric, and I were all staying with Eric's parents. We had brought some night vision binoculars and decided that tonight was the perfect time to use them. So, after dinner, we gear up and head out. We pass under the freeway and head into the woods. When we get about 5 minutes into the forest, we set down our bag and take out our binocs. My mom looks around with them for a while, seeing a few squirrels here and there. She gets tired of them and passes them to me. I look around for a while, being careful not to look at the freeway for fear of being blinded. I spot something behind a tree about 50 feet to our left. I concentrate on it, trying to figure out what it is. It looks like a pale, bald anorexic man looking straight at us from behind the tree. I get a bit uneasy, but I'm hesitant to believe it's really there. I ask Eric to take a look, just in case. To my despair, he sees it too. He describes it much the same way I did. Now, Eric is a former amateur boxer, and I train MMA almost every day, but neither one of us wants to stick around with that thing. We start heading back to the house, crossing under the freeway. We take another look behind us as a car comes by. All three of us see glowing eyes lit up by the headlights on the other side of the freeway. We say fuck that and head back to the house. When we get back, Eric's parents are asleep and my mom and Eric go upstairs to the guest room. There's only one guest room, so I have the couch downstairs. I'm a little too excited after seeing the thing in the woods, so I end up staying up all night. Around 3 a.m., I'm watching TV and start hearing footsteps above me. I immediately remember our earlier encounter and panic a little. I try to calm down and tell myself it's just one of the dogs or maybe someone who couldn't sleep. I keep hearing the footsteps for a while, until I hear a doorknob jiggle. I find it weird that they're trying to open a locked door, but try to ignore it. They stop, walk around for a few more minutes, and then it's quiet again. I stay up until the sun starts coming up and then pass out. My mom wakes me up, and I remember the footsteps from the night before. I describe what happened and ask if one of them got up at any time. She says no, and I think it must have been one of the dogs. That is, until she tells me the room above me is the office. No one was in the office, and the door stays locked at night. My heart sinks as I piece it all together. I don't know if it was that thing for sure, but I think it was. I've done a lot of research since then, trying to figure out what that thing was that night. I found two creatures that seemed to match it. I think it was either a skinwalker or wendigo. Whichever one it was, I'm just thankful that door was locked. I know I wouldn't be able to fight that thing no matter how tough I am. Sixth story. Wendigo encounter. I've been debating on sharing this story with anyone outside of my small circle of people that were there. But I want to share my experience in hopes that it saves someone's life or to give understanding of what someone else has experienced. Late fall 2010. In northern Canada, I went deep into the wilderness with my father and my eldest brother to hunt for moose. We left in the early morning, just before sunrise, trying to cover as much distance as possible before nightfall. We traveled winding rivers and had to repeatedly portage over rapids all day. We decided to set up camp just over halfway to our destination. My father figured that we'd make the rest of the journey tomorrow. Well, when everyone bedded down for the night, I decided to go grab some firewood and relieve myself down by the bank of the river, just out of reach of the light from the campfire. Out from the tree line, about 15 yards away, I could hear rustling in the bushes. I watched the area where I heard the noise and focused on that spot. I felt kind of funny, dizzy/lightheaded, and I could smell this putrid stink, like old milk or rotten food. Then I saw the trees start to morph and move ever so slightly and began to take the shape of a head and slight facial features. My eyes began to adjust to the darkness and along the tree line. I could hear this voice coming from there. I recognized it. The voice sounded like one of my relatives who had recently passed. The face took shape of my relative. "Hello," they said. "I've missed you. Come see me." I smiled and stepped forward a bit, but stopped to analyze the situation. My relative's face stopped smiling and became emotionless. The skin began to turn pale and peel away. Chunks of flesh from their cheeks began to fall away, and I felt shock and fear overwhelm my body. I couldn't make sense of it at all, so I started to back away and make my way to camp. I didn't realize at the time that I had been walking towards the voice, and I was further away from the firelight. The voice became angry and began shouting at me to come here. So I turned to run away, but as I looked back one more time, I saw the most disgusting thing I had ever seen. It was rotting flesh on gnawed bone, caved-in eyes, and a hollow chest cavity. This humanoid creature was tall and super thin. I ran as fast as I could, trying to yell for help, but the fear had made my voice quiet and raspy, I ran along the riverbank and I could hear the heavy breaths and the stomping feet from this thing right behind me. I made it onto the top of the riverbank, but it grabbed a hold of my leg as I jumped up. I gripped and tore the grass trying to lift myself and yelled as loud as I could. Then finally my voice came back and I yelled that someone has my leg. My brother woke up and ran over to where I was. Then he pulled me up and took me over to the fire. I was terrified, trying to explain what I saw and that it looked like my relative but not. I was trying to convince them that I wasn't seeing things, but my brother nodded his head and said, "I saw it too. I know." That solidified it. He acknowledged that it was real. We stayed up all night after that, rifles loaded and close by. We packed up when the sun was coming up and went back home. We haven't shared that story with anyone out of fear of being labeled as crazy or liars. I've had nightmares and couldn't sleep for months afterwards. I would see things/dark figures looking into my window or hear whispers when I was walking home at night. Eventually, I was seeing this dark figure daily. I went to medicine men/shaman for help, but I've learned that the ceremonies only relieves it temporarily. Friends have given me everything from protection pouches to certain crystals. I found out that there's a strong possibility that I encountered a Wendigo. I learned that if you encounter one and survive, it attaches itself to you like a parasite. I learned that it could only do this if it touches you, which it did. Ever since that night, I've been on edge when I enter any forest or wooded area, which sucks because I love being outdoors/hunting and in nature. Now I always feel like I need to keep my back against something when I'm out in the wild. Anyways, make your own conclusions about this. I've paid a price for being an ignorant child to the stories of old. They are real. I can attest to that. Stay safe, everyone. 7th story. It's illegal to use Loveland Road. I know why. As I sat down to write this, I started to wonder how many of you may have passed through Alcon, Nebraska. I can't blame you if you don't remember. I'd wager I can count on 2 hands the number of visitors that stayed for more than a day in the whole time I've lived here. There's not much to do, or even look at really. With a population of 10,000 tops and 2 movie theaters, 1 high school, 1 McDonald's, and a baker's dozen or so of local restaurants between us. But I've of course always had a bias for the place I grew up, so I'd indignantly defend any snide remarks made about Alcon. The people are nice, there's little crime, and the high school's got a good graduation rate. What's not to like? But now I can't urge all of you enough that if you pass Alcon while on a road trip or something, you need to keep driving. I know that the next town is a good ways away, but please, don't stop in Alcon. But if I can't convince you to tough out a bit more driving, at least listen to this. Don't use Loveland Road. Growing up in a small town has advantages and disadvantages. An advantage is that if someone is in trouble, you can bet that a small army of neighbors would be there to help them. A disadvantage is that if someone is trouble, the whole goddamn populace knows about it. And I'm willing to bet that Mr. and Mrs. Samuel experienced the full force of both ends of this spectrum 2 years ago. Alexandra Samuel, their oldest daughter, went missing after going for a morning bike ride. She was a senior at the time, a grade above me, and I had talked to her once or twice. She was sweet and pretty, always wore dresses and had glasses. You can bet that the whole of Alcon knew by sundown. An incident like that was so alien to our community. Remember when I said there was little crime? Yeah, well, the worst thing before Alexandra was the suspected arson of an abandoned barn. Search parties got together. Posters were put up. It was all anyone talked about. There truly was no trace of where Alexandra had disappeared to. Then seemingly all at once the police called off the effort. Information about that case became suspiciously hard to get after that, which of course only heightened interest. The only word from the police department after that was that the investigation was taken to a state level. Then radio silence. Things didn't change much in Alcon in the following weeks. The Samuels understandably moved shortly after and business bummed along as usual. There was, however, our town's little unsolved mystery bubbling under the surface. Oh, that and people weren't allowed to drive on Loveland Road. I was surprised that more people didn't notice any correlation of those two events. Maybe it was just that nobody knew that the second one even happened. Heck, I only knew because my dad had a bad habit of announcing quite literally everything in the newspaper during breakfast every morning. Here it says Alcon Council just ordered Loveland Road closed. Huh. He said more to himself than us, half interested I skimming the paper. I asked my parents if they thought it had anything to do with Alexandra. All I got in response was that annoying parent, I don't know. Act that really meant that they weren't up for thinking that morning. But for some reason, I couldn't let it go. That same day I brought it up to my friends, and some of them shared my intrigue. Upon checking the paper for myself later, there was no reason actually listed for why Loveland Road was closed. In the paper itself, that is. As I recount this, it's almost eerie how things came together. In my English 3 class, we were assigned a project to pick a recent news article or research it at the library. She made it very clear nobody was to do their project on Alexandra. I don't think anyone would have anyway. It was too real, too soon. Either way, I'm sure you can guess which little blurb of an article I chose. When I went to the library the following weekend to request any additional info about Loveland Road being closed, the librarian said that the article I already had was it. A bit taken back, I settled for any other articles in reference to the road. There was only one. 2 officers go missing while on manhunt. While in pursuit of Rick Smith, suspected of domestic abuse and assault of a police officer, Officers John Smith and John J. followed an anonymous tip from a source in Alcon claiming to have seen him at a gas station. Smith and J. responded to the call at 7:30 p.m. on June 8th, informing their supervisor they were conducting a follow-up. When the officers arrived at the gas station, they spotted the suspect's vehicle fleeing the scene and radioed that they were pursuing and requested backup. The officers and suspect were last seen continuing the chase onto Loveland Road, when shortly after Officer J radioed in that suspect has exited the vehicle, continuing pursuit on foot. This was the last known contact with either officer. Responders found both J and Smith's unattended cruiser and the suspect's vehicle at the scene. Alcon PD has stated that investigation and searches are ongoing for both the suspect and the officers. If you see this man. Obviously, I replaced the names for anonymity. But the point stands that this only made me more unsettled and curious about Loveland Road. Upon showing the article to my friends, they seemed to share the sentiment, which is when we decided to give a little visit to the street for ourselves. I know. Stupid. Horrendously stupid. But keep in mind you're reading this in the context of this no-sleep. If you were reading this anywhere else, you'd expect that there was nothing, or at most, it was creepy. We just thought it'd make for an interesting story. So me and 3 of my friends went to hang out one Saturday and learn why it was illegal to use Loveland Road. As we went driving, we noted how distant the road actually was from the rest of Alcon, which is saying something. Long before we reached Loveland, the road turned to gravel, and then to dirt. When we pulled onto the road in Trent's car, he was the only one of us who had his own. Sure enough, there was one of those wooden police barriers blocking the way with a bright orange sign reading, "Road closed." This didn't stop curious teenagers, of course. Little does. We pushed the barrier to the side, a tinge of excitement brewing in me, and we continued on. Getting further and further down the path, we noticed more and more signs indicating we weren't supposed to be there. These 2 predictably went ignored until we finally stopped and decided to look around. Loveland Road was totally covered on either side by dense woods. But since it was late November, most of the leaves had long fallen off and made everything seem gray and empty. Even though it was still daytime, I could see my breath in the air as I stepped out of the car. I didn't remember it being that chilly when we first left, but then again it was a long drive. We all began picking around, armed with bats, surveying the woods as if we might find something that the police had overlooked. I think we were excited simply by the fact that we weren't supposed to be here, not really expecting to find anything. But we did. After a while, we all just started bullshitting around, talking while walking the length of the road, the novelty of the setting having worn off. We'd been out for about an hour, and the sun was beginning to set. And even though we were bullheaded and fairly relaxed, no way were we going to stay on that road at night. We collectively turned around and began making our way back to Trent's car. That's when we heard the screaming. It was faint, really faint. Call stopped us, though, and made us listen. Somewhere, far away to our left, we could hear a throaty, frantic scream. Every few seconds it would stop, then pick up again at full force. I'd like to think the way we reacted was fairly rational. Trent took off running down the street. We began to chase after him when he called back to us. "I'm gonna grab my car. You guys go find them. I'm calling the police." The three of us took off towards the screaming, bats in hand. I guess at the time we all thought that there was a chance it could be Alexandra. Maybe she had gotten lost and only now got the strength to call for help. Maybe she had escaped from someone who'd taken her. None of us could have guessed the source of that sound. The screaming only got louder and more gurgly as we got closer, and I could feel myself begin to lose nerve. But Kyle and Mason kept trucking forward, so I did my best to steel myself and keep up. Any semblance of confidence we had was shattered when we turned into a small valley the scream echoed from. First I saw the man. He was bound at the wrist and ankles with this heavy rope. Encompassing the rest of his body was this crude-looking steel cage. The man was struggling against the machine he was trapped in, but every few moments the iron bars shifted, just a little, outwards. It was such a slight change. I actually heard something in him pop from where we were, followed by an anguishing screech. My eyes followed the framework of the machine against my will, along the man, to a crank that was very slowly being turned, to a hand. Then I saw the rest of it. It was tall, hideously, unnaturally tall, and thin. Its hollow, milky eyes met mine. It looked to be smiling, but the skin was so tight on its face I couldn't tell. Everything about it seemed stretched out. The limbs, the face, all except the clothes, all except a dirty, broken glasses and a tattered dress. We all ran. Never before have I felt such impending terror in my life. My lungs burned and I kept scraping my legs on branches and logs, but never once did we stop. Before my mind registered I was even on the street, we kept on running towards where Trent's car was parked. It had finally begun to get dark. Mason started shouting down the road, hoping Trent would hear us and hurry. After 5 minutes of a full sprint, my body finally trumped my fear. I slowed and crouched for a moment, trying in vain to catch my breath. Mason and Kyle stopped too, both breathing heavily and producing cell phones. The only words I could produce were "fucking fuck," as I buried my head in my hands. We all heard the faint moan at once. All of our eyes shooting back at once, we saw it standing in the middle of the street, looking at us. This one was even taller, scarcely covered in torn blue fabric. I pulled myself up and we sprinted straight into the trees in front of us. Knowing we couldn't run much longer, we tried to find a place to hide while Kyle dialed 911. Kyle and Mason both shimmied under a huge fallen log and tried to make room for me. I knew I wouldn't fit. "It's fine," I told them. "There's a hollow tree here. Just fucking hurry and get the cops." And with that I squeezed myself into the tree and clutched my back close to me. I don't know how much time had passed, but it was much too long. The police should have reached us by now. I asked Kyle what 911 said in a hushed whisper, and he said the operator insisted someone was coming and he should stay off his phone. That didn't sound right at all, as most operators insist you stay on the line, but I didn't have long to consider this when I heard the heavy crunching of leaves. The time between steps was great, but each one was considerably closer. I tried to make myself small as possible as I swallowed back tears. Crunch. Silence. Crunch. Silence. Crunch. Silence. I wrenched my eyes open and slowly my eyes adjusted to the darkness outside of the rift in the tree. 2 milky eyes. A pain smile. torn blue fabric, the glint of a badge that read, John J. A loud humming, sweeping lights through the trees. I blacked out. Later, I learned that the police sent a helicopter to our location. Later, I learned this was because the road was unstable and prone to sinkholes. Later, I learned that Trent and his car were yet to be found, and they suspect that he may have gone off-road and sunken into one. Later, I learned that the story never appeared in the news. I don't know what we saw on Loveland Road that night. I don't know what happened to Trent. And I don't know why Alexandra's story was covered while the police kept a tight lid on what happened to us. But what I do know is this: why it's illegal to use Loveland Road, and why you should keep driving if you happen to pass by Alcon. Because while I was talking to my mom the other day, she told me something that resurfaced this old, horrible memory. Another road closed yesterday. Beaver Creek. 9th story. A beautiful monster in the woods. As soon as I heard her voice, I froze. She called out again. "Hello, little boy," she said. "Can you help me?" I turned to face her. She was behind me on the forest path, back the way I had just come. How could I not have seen her? Everything about her was pale. Pale white skin, pale blue eyes, and pale blonde hair. Her thin, graceful body was draped in a flowing and sheer, almost translucent white dress. Her eyes caught mine and guided them down to her foot, which I now saw was wedged under a heavy log. "You look like a strong little boy," she said. "I bet you could lift this log up right over your head." She smiled. Her face eased into a mask of kindness, but beneath their shine her pale eyes flickered with a strange coldness. "I'm not supposed to talk to strangers," I said, taking a step back. The woman's smile broadened, but her eyes grew colder, like two blue chips of ice. "But you already talked to me," she said. "Just now." "Well, yeah, but And I'm sure your mother would never want you to refuse a lady in need," she continued. "Do you know what chivalry is, David?" Had I told her my name? I must have. "Uh-huh," I said. "It's like holding the door open for ladies." Her eyes sparkled. "Right you are," she said. "Chivalry is helping those in need, especially fair maidens. It's what knights do. Do you know what a knight is?" My face grew hot with anger. "Of course I know what a knight is," I said. "What kind of person doesn't know what a knight is?" I sometimes forgot how stupid grown-ups could be. "Would you like to be a knight, David?" she asked. Her voice had grown hushed and smooth, like the rustle of silk sheets. I suddenly realized that the woman seemed to be growing, the world swaying. No, that wasn't right. I was walking. Why was I walking? I stopped. I seemed to be just out of her reach. For some reason I could not pinpoint, that fact seemed very important to me. "Why are you stopping, David?" the woman asked. Her pale blue eyes flickered for a moment, like a broken fluorescent light, and in that instant they were no longer blue, but solid black, like the eyes of a doll. My stomach dropped. I took a step back. "I really need to go home," I said. Her eyes flickered black again, and then her whole face. Beneath the milk-white skin was something like rough black leather. Thick yellow fluid oozed from cracks in her reptilian skin. Her black eyes were wide and crazed, and her mouth opened in a wide yawn to reveal 2 rows of jagged, razor-sharp teeth. I could feel myself tilting forward, falling into her mouth. My face was blasted by the hot stink of her breath. It smelled like wet earth and rotting leaves. "Don't you want to be a knight?" A voice whispered inside my head. "Just one more step, and you can be my knight forever." My leg felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, but I managed to lift my foot and take a step backwards. The spell was instantly broken. I tumbled back to the forest floor, and when I looked up, the woman looked like a woman again, but she was no longer smiling. I was shaking as I pushed myself back to my feet. I felt exhausted, but I sprinted all the way home anyway, ignoring the calls of the woman that came from behind me. The next day at school there was an assembly. The principal gave a speech while a serious-faced policeman stood next to him. One of the first graders, Sam Coogan, had disappeared on his way home. The principal urged anyone who knew anything to please come forward. No one spoke. That day, after school, I knew I had to walk the same path. Once my parents heard about Sam Coogan, I knew they would never let me walk home again, and I had to see for myself. I had to make sure. When the log was in sight, I stopped. There was something red poking up from the leaves beside it. Slowly, I walked closer. At first, I couldn't be sure what it was. It looked like maroon confetti, but when I was close enough to get a better look, I saw. It looked like an animal that the wolves had got to, except for one thing. In the middle of the puddle of red was a single child's shoe. I heard a rustle of leaves behind me, and I ran. I ran until my chest was on fire and my legs were rubber. And not once did I look back. 8th story. Possible Wendigo encounter. So last night, I awoke at around 3 a.m. after going to bed at 12. I went to get some water and sat back down on my bed, staring out my window. I live in a heavily wooded area in New York, not the city, so hopefully that helps set the scene a little. So I was looking out my window, and there are many trees visible outside my window as my house is on a cliffside. I'm kind of at the middle of the 30-foot tall trees. The window I was looking out overlooked the cliff, and the trees are right in front of me. The moonlight illuminated something on one of the trees. It was a humanoid-like figure, and its features were barely visible through the darkness. I looked at it in fear, as it was about 7 feet tall but appeared to be crouched down on the sturdy branch. After about 10 seconds, it turned its head and looked at me. Its eyes were red, and it stared at me for about another 10 seconds, and then it looked like it fell off the branch. I rushed to the window to see what had happened to the thing, but it took off into the bushes and greenery of the forest floor. It moved fast. I saw the bushes moving as it got further away in the moonlight. I'd like to know if anyone knows what this creature was. I believe in the paranormal, but I haven't yet had any encounters with anything besides this. I did some shallow research and believe what I saw was possibly a Wendigo, although I'm still not sure at all. If you think you know anything, please reach out to me. 10th story. We saw something in the woods. I don't know what to think about this. Does anyone know what we should do? I guess I should start at the beginning. I'll do my best to say what happened. Recently, my brother Zach has gotten really into nature photography. Last weekend, we decided to go camping so he could take some pictures. We live on the East Coast, so finding places far from cities is pretty hard. Luckily, Zach found what seemed like this perfect place on Google Maps. The map showed a wide open clearing right next to a road. It looked like a few hours' drive, but we decided to give it a shot. I packed up my gear and our dog Major. My brother loaded the car with his camera equipment, and we set off towards the spot. As we got close, I saw that the paved road ended. An old "No Trespassing" sign was hanging on a rusty gate. I could see a long dirt road curve out into the woods behind it. We didn't want to trespass, but we'd driven so far. I asked Zach what he thought. He figured that the road and the land was probably just the property of some lumber company. It sounded about right to me. We noticed that the gate blocking the road wasn't even locked, and that sealed the deal. Zach jumped out and opened it for the car. After that, we found the spot without too much trouble. It was pretty much perfect, at least at first. We unloaded our firewood and pretty soon had a good blaze going in the middle of the clearing. Major was running around sniffing everything, looking like he was having the time of his life. Major was a pit bull. We'd had him in our family for almost 5 years. He was a great dog, if a little dumb. I loved that dog more than most people. He had helped me through a lot of tough times. Soon it was dark. We had read online that there would be thick cloud cover that night. The prediction was spot on. It seemed like the clouds were thick logs, just brushing over the tops of the trees. The only light for miles came from our little fire. I started making some dinners wrapped in tinfoil. Zach was holding his camera, taking pictures of an owl that was sitting in a tree in the distance. He dropped his camera, letting it hang from its neck strap. He looked at me and complained about feeling uneasy. I figured he was just being anxious and didn't put much stock in it while I put together the food. Suddenly silence rang out through the trees. I realized that may not make much sense, but let me explain. If any of you have ever gone camping in the forest, you know there is almost constant sound of crickets, frogs, and the occasional owl. It all stopped in a split second. I stood up from my chair and looked into the woods. A distinct clicking sound came echoing into the clearing. Put your thumbnail behind your front tooth and pull until it makes a hard clack. It came in bursts. 3 clicks, silence. 5 clicks, silence. It sounded wrong somehow, like nails on a chalkboard or a fork screeching across a china plate. I can't explain it, but the click mixed with the silence made the hairs on my neck stand up. Major jumped up and stared towards the sound. I could see how tense he was. He began barking like mad. Major always been an incredibly easygoing dog. He was freaking out like nothing I'd ever seen before. Before we could do anything, he bolted towards the sound. I jumped up and chased after him to the edge of the clearing, but he was too fast. He reached the tree line and disappeared into the darkness. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, breathing hard. Zach was close behind me, his camera bouncing on its strap. The clicking stopped, and the chirping of crickets rang out again through the woods. I stopped at the edge of the clearing and shouted after Major. I heard nothing in response. Zach stood staring into the woods uneasily. He asked me what I thought the clicking noise was. I told him that I had no idea. I pulled out my flashlight and told him we needed to go after Major. He looked less than happy, but agreed. I turned back into the woods and started walking in the direction that Major had taken off. After just a few minutes of walking, the light of the small fire was completely blocked by the trees. The only light source that I could see was my flashlight. The woods seemed almost too dark. The thick clouds and remote location gave the woods an almost physical blackness. It reminded me of when I went caving a few years back. Zach and I kept on calling out to Major. After a few minutes, I heard a faint whimpering sound. I called for Zach to stop walking and we listened. Zach nodded and whispered, "Yeah, that's Major." Up ahead. We pushed on. Up in the distance, I saw a clearing in the trees. In the middle of it, I saw a huge concrete building. Decades-old graffiti covered the sides. It looked completely out of place in the middle of the woods. I pointed my flashlight at the ground around us. Neither me nor my brother could see any roads that led up to the building. Zach lifted his camera and took a picture. The flash lit up the clearing like a strike of lightning. While we stood there, I thought I heard the sounds of Major whimpering. They sounded like they were from inside the building. I started walking towards the building. Zach called out, "Hang on, man. Let's think about this for a second." I got pretty mad. I wanted to go get my dog, who was scared and alone in this creepy building. I told Zach he was being ridiculous, especially if he was scared of some clicking. He whispered back to me, "All I'm saying is let's be careful, all right? No sense running in and cutting a leg open on a rusty piece of metal." I wish I'd had the sense to listen to him. We walked towards the building. A heavy metal door hung from its hinges in the front of the building. I walked through the doorway and started calling out to Major again. I heard Zach step through the door behind me as I made my way deeper into the structure. The floor and walls of the hallway were all made of rough concrete. I saw graffiti that must have been decades old covering the walls. The end of the hallway turned to the right. As I made the turn, I saw a pool of something discolored on the ground. The heavy stench of decay hit me like a wave. My flashlight flickered and went out. I stood in the darkness clicking the button, but nothing happened. I figured the batteries had to have run out. I unscrewed the battery cap, switched the position of the batteries, and then put it back on. The flashlight flicked on, but the light was faint. It spilled over what was clearly a several-day-old deer carcass lying on the ground. Its head was nowhere to be seen. Zach started retching and coughing into his sleeve. "Do you think a bear lives here or something?" he said between coughs. My flashlight died again. The darkness was absolute. The stench filling my nostrils made it hard to breathe. I called out again to Major. I heard Zach fiddling with his camera. Here. He moved in front of me. The camera flashed, lighting up the hallway for a split second. It'll help some, but not much, he said. Maybe we should go back for more lights. I shook my head even though it was pointless in the dark. Who knows where Major will have run off to by the time we get back? I heard a yelp of fear and pain from up in the distance. Just keep taking pictures. We kept walking down the hallway, careful to step around the deer. Every 3 seconds or so Zach took a picture, lighting up the hallway and the rooms on either side that we passed. Some rooms had pools of fluid spilling into the hallways. Zach stopped suddenly and I ran into his back. What is it? He didn't respond, staring at his camera's display. What is that? He whispered under his breath. Then I heard it. A noise echoed down the hallway. Click, 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 click. Getting louder. I felt numb. I stared into the blackness, not able to see anything. Zach took another picture, and light flashed out. I saw it, whatever it was. It almost looked like a human, but deathly white, pale, and naked. It had unnaturally long arms with claws that extended at least a foot from each finger. I saw something brown all over its chin and chest. I think it must have been dried blood. It was on all fours, staring at us. I shouted for Zach to run. I grabbed his shoulder, and we sprinted back down the hallway the way we had come. I saw one more flash from Zach's camera just in time to step into the deer's body. We ran out of the building and into the woods. I don't know how we made it through the woods and back to the fire, but once we did, we didn't even pause to pack up our things. We jumped into the car and drove out of there. All this was yesterday. I can't stop thinking about Major. We left him there, with whatever that thing was. Every time I think about it, my hands shake. Still, I can't stand the thought of Major out there alone. We're going to have to go back. We'll bring some weapons and more lights, and I hope that's enough. I'd call the police, but what will we say? We were trespassing. No, it has to be us. Note, if anyone knows how to edit the pictures to make them clearer, we'd appreciate it. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.